Hello, and welcome back to the Live Label Free podcast and part 4 of my series on autism and binge eating. If you've listened to the previous episodes of this series, I'm sure you've already learned a lot. And if you have, could you do me a teeny tiny favor and leave a 5-star rating and positive review for this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts? It's a completely free way for you to show your support and helps more people find this podcast so we can all increase our understanding of the link between neurodivergence and eating disorders. That being said, in part 1 you learned what interoception is and how it can lead to difficulty sensing hunger and fullness, and we talked about the difference between extreme hunger and binge eating disorder. In part 2, we talked about the nervous system and how this relates to the sensory experience of food, including using food to stim and to procrastinate. In part 3, we dove even deeper into the procrastination aspect, touching on autistic inertia and difficulty with transitions. In this 4th and final part, we're going to unpack the role of black and white thinking, analysis paralysis, food needing to make sense, and at the end, I'll be sharing a resource to learn more about the hormonal autistic binge, that is to say, when binging is the result of PMS or PMDD.
Gotta put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be around the corner soon.
Welcome to the Live Label Free podcast, where we talk about autism, ADHD, eating disorders, existentialism, and everything in between. I'm your host, Livia Sarah. Now let's get into it. First off, black and white thinking. I did an episode over a year ago titled Black and White Thinking in Autism and Anorexia, in which I talked about how the purpose of black and white thinking is to gain a sense of tangible control in a world that is really intangible and out of our control. And while anorexia is typically seen as the control eating disorder and binge eating is often associated with someone who lacks control, I want to challenge that narrative right away. In fact, no eating disorder is about control. They're about gaining a sense of safety and security. And this starts with viewing eating disorders as an adaptation rather than a pathological disease. Autistic people tend to view the world with such depth and nuance that it can be really overwhelming. Personally, I've asked existential questions for as long as I can remember. This curiosity was born from trying to make sense of a world that, well, doesn't. To avoid the existential angst that accompanies infinite options and viewpoints, most autistic people instinctively adapt their mindset to view the world in black and white. Because of this adaptation, autistic people are considered to be rigid and inflexible. However, the opposite is true. In reality, autistic people are incredibly flexible and consider a variety of options before drawing conclusions. But because we then tend to get caught in a state of paralysis due to our ongoing mental analyses, it's so much easier to avoid the zone of colorful nuance. It's so much easier to see the world in black and white. And when we see the world in black and white, all or nothing, the answers are clear. It's either this or that, option 1 or option 2. By shielding yourself from the in-betweens, you are attempting to protect yourself. That is to say, to manipulate your nervous system to perceive safety. This is why I believe it's so much more appropriate to view eating disorders of any kind as a spectrum of adaptive eating behaviors, something you'll learn way more about in my upcoming Autistically ED-free group coaching program. Not only will this program involve live group coaching calls with me on a variety of topics that connect autism with food issues, but there's also going to be a private community, and don't worry, it will not be another Facebook group, where you can interact, share struggles, and get advice from other people in the same boat as you. Whether you yourself are neurodivergent and are looking to improve your relationship with food and movement, or are a parent or caregiver, or are a healthcare professional that's committed to learning and want to better serve your clientele, you can learn more about my Autistically ED-free group coaching program at livelabelfree.com/group. Now, circling back to black and white thinking, this autistic trait can be a huge factor when it comes to binge eating. For example, say you go into the kitchen and are feeling like some ice cream. Because you struggle to interpret internal cues due to interoceptive difficulties, as discussed in part 1 of this series, you really don't know if you want 1 scoop or 2 scoops or a big bowl or perhaps a cone. Now, during my anorexia, I had so many rules around food to prevent this analysis paralysis, which is a term used to describe the inability to make a decision due to having too many options. It didn't matter how I was feeling or whether I had a hunger cue or not. I always ate the same things at the exact same times. When I started recovery from restriction, my meal plan gave me a new thing to hold on to, a new set of rules to follow, so I didn't feel like I was completely drowning in this existential storm of infinite choices. But just like my anorexia had done, it was a new form of entrapment. I had zero flexibility in my life, meaning I wasn't able to do the things I really wanted to do. And because the internet and the recovery community preaches this idea that going all in is the only way to fully recover from your eating disorder, well, can you guess what choice I made? Now, I did do a whole separate episode on why all-in recovery didn't work for me and what I did instead, in which I explain why it often doesn't work for autistic people specifically, and that has to do with the black and white thinking mindset. Autistic people need constraints. We need boundaries to feel safe. So the idea of just listening to your body and eating intuitively are just way too vague, which ultimately can cause someone to spiral into unhealthy habits such as always saying no to food or always choosing the healthy or light option in the case of restriction. But it can also go the other way and precipitate binging. Going back to the ice cream example, without any kind of guidelines or routines in place, it can be so overwhelming to have to decide right then and there how much ice cream you're going to have that you may just start eating from the container. And as you're eating, you're starting to feel like, okay, this is getting to be a bit much. But because there's no logic involved in the eating process, because you've been conditioned by treatment centers or online influencers that you can just trust your body to say stop, you throw your trusty black and white thinking into gear and say, oh fuck it, I've already eaten half the container and I feel sick, so I might as well keep going and finish it off. Now, I'm actually reminded of a video that an anti-diet content creator posted on Instagram a while back, in which he said, if you accidentally stubbed your toe, would you purposely stub your other toe? And while the video in the comments expressed that it obviously seems silly to purposely hurt yourself again just because you hurt yourself before, and I mean, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing, yeah, that really would be an odd thing to do. I actually did once stub my other toe after hurting the one on the other foot. I'm actually making no joke here. Let me tell you the story. So when I was living back in Boston, oh gosh, this must have been in like 2010 or something. I was a little kid. I stubbed my toe on our staircase, and we had one of those staircases that was covered in fabric, but I was going to walk up the stairs and I just hit my toe. I mean, it happens to the best of us, right? And I was so mad at the staircase at that moment in time, and again, I'm not sure if that was a form of object personification, which is attaching morality and feelings to inanimate objects, which is a really common trait in autistic people, and I actually talked about this in a YouTube video I filmed years ago about my top 10 childhood autistic traits, but that's beside the point. The point is that I stubbed my toe, and because I was so mad at the staircase, I wanted to hurt the staircase back. I obviously could not kick the staircase with the foot that I had just stubbed my toe with, so I used my other foot to kick the staircase, in which case I just ended up now having 2 feet that hurt. And I remember my mom, I went over to my mom crying like, ow, I stubbed my toe and I was so mad at the staircase, and then I kicked the staircase with the other foot and now both my feet hurt. And I remember my mom saying, well, it isn't the staircase's fault, but I just did not want to admit that I had made a mistake. The reason I share this story is because it goes to show that neurodivergent individuals often can know logically that their all or nothing mentality isn't helpful, just like knowing that eating an entire gallon of ice cream isn't beneficial to your health or well-being. But it really is worth putting a little reminder here that if you are going through extreme hunger, you are in a different situation. As I ate multiple pints of ice cream on multiple occasions during my extreme hunger because I still had a lot of energy debt to pay off. And be sure to listen to part 1 of this series and honestly all my other podcasts on extreme hunger if you think you may be going through this. And if you want like a full-on deep dive into extreme hunger and want to learn the science behind it, how to overcome it, how to find that food freedom but without losing the control, which we feel we're going to lose, be sure to grab a copy of my book, How to Beat Extreme Hunger, at livelabelfree.com/extreme hunger book. Now, coming back to the main episode, in the case of true overeating or true binge eating, all logic goes out the window. Your most primal instincts just take over, and if there aren't any guidelines in place that help you to accommodate your neurodivergent nervous system, you're continuously going to set yourself up to engage in unhealthy coping mechanisms. Setting up your own constraints and learning how to set boundaries with food in a way that doesn't feel restrictive or activate demand avoidance is something that's very unique to each individual, which is why I just don't feel comfortable giving any advice or suggestions here. But if you do want help in creating those accommodations for yourself, be sure to learn more about coaching with me at livelabelfree.com/coaching. So when it comes to autistic brains and food, black and white thinking has a twin, and this twin is food needing to make sense. If you've never heard me talk about this concept before, please do yourself a huge favor and listen to my podcast episode titled When Food Has to Make Sense, in which I explain exactly what autistic people mean when we use this phrase. How it relates to binge eating will again be very unique to each individual, but for me, the biggest way this manifests is food needing to have a certain look. Say, for example, I'm in the mood for some chocolate. One of my favorite chocolates is the Lindt 85% chocolate bar. And because I'm autistic and pay attention to the details of food, because it influences my behaviors and portions around said food, I know that the bar has 2 columns and 5 rows, making the bar have a total of 10 squares of chocolate. Well, one of the most appalling things to me is people being able to eat the chocolate without breaking the chocolate according to the pre-molded lines. Like, there are people who will just randomly break off a chunk of chocolate and not break off the individual squares. I seriously cannot understand it. Anyways, for me, I always have to eat an entire row or multiple rows of the chocolate. I cannot eat 1 square or 3 squares because then the bar would no longer be a perfect rectangle. However, if I had a bar that's 3 columns instead of 2, I would be able to eat 3 squares and I wouldn't be able to eat 2 or 4 because then the bar wouldn't be a perfect rectangle. So you see, how I eat is wholly dependent on how my mind feels about the way the food looks when I finish. Okay, so chocolate is an easy example. The foods I usually ended up binging on were foods that will almost always have an uneven look. That is to say, there's no tangible way of making them look complete or incomplete like in the case of chocolate. So for these foods, and I talk about this at length in my episode, 3 more ED behaviors that are actually autistic traits, I say that the food has to be smoothed out. And 2 examples that come to mind that I always have in my house are peanut butter and yogurt. During my anorexia, I would always base the amount of food I consumed on it being weighed or measured. And if we're being honest, I'd usually do both. For peanut butter, it was 2 tablespoons or 32 grams. No more, no less. For yogurt, it was either 1 pre-portioned container, half a cup, 2/3 of a cup, 3/4 of a cup, or 1 cup. Never more, and there were definitely no in-betweens. When I went through extreme hunger, my body was like, neat rules, but they're going out the window. I consumed jars upon jars of nut butters in days, and I could easily eat an entire kilogram tub of full-fat Greek yogurt in less than 5 minutes. This was very important for me to go through, not only because it literally forced me to break these restrictive rules I had around portions, but my body physically needed all of those calories. The true challenge for me then came when I was learning how much my body needed after this extreme hunger period. I didn't want to go back to meticulously weighing and measuring food because it made me feel very restricted. And even if I was planning on having a portion that was significantly larger than in the past, I find that my demand avoidance is often triggered. To elaborate, even if I said, okay, you won't have 2 tablespoons, but you'll have 8 tablespoons of peanut butter, which is equivalent to half a cup or 120 grams, my PDA brain would probably respond with, you can't tell me how much to have, I get to decide. And then I may end up eating the entire peanut butter jar because I can't get it to look perfectly smoothed out and there are no intuitive guidelines I have around the amount. So I have to be honest with you here in saying that this is somewhat of a new struggle for me that I didn't have a few years ago, and it's something I'm still actively working through. I do often find myself eating way more of these foods that will just never have this perfectly satisfactory look to them. But as with everything in life, I trust that I will get through this, just like I trust that you will get through this. Everything in life happens for us. It happens so that we can grow and continuously turn our best into better. And although that is a beautiful conclusion to this episode, I did promise you at the beginning that I would talk about the hormonal binge, aka binging as a result of PMS or PMDD. Well, by the time this episode comes out, I have already posted an entire episode titled Autism, PMDD, and Extreme Hunger, in which I share my experience with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, what this is, why it's more common in neurodivergent people, and how it can contribute to binge eating. So, if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend you listen to it next, and otherwise, I'll talk to you in the next episode. Bye-bye for now.
Baby, just 1 foot in front of the other.